First things first, we're going to get a little update on what's happening in the industry, just generally, so that all of you are aware. We have provincial CEOs, we have the commodity CEOs, as well as the corporate guys. So we literally almost have the whole industry together here. And then we can field any questions and any other remarks that we want to make, we can do. All right, so let's just start with a quick prayer. Tinus, sal jy gou vir ons bid asseblief? Kyk, Tinus. Ons kan nie hoor nie, Tinus.
Tinus, just unmute yourself, please.
Unmute yourself, Tinus. Okay, Tinus. Okay, we can't hear you, Tinus. But let's ask Christy then to just.
Ek is nou reg. Ek kom.
Okay, so jy gaan vir ons gebed.
Ek maak so.
Okay.
Dankie liefde God Hemelse Vader. Here, baie dankie vir 'n oggend wat U vir ons gegee het, Here. Baie dankie vir die natuur daar buite, waar ons hoor dit reën lekker in die Kaap, Here. Mense spog daaroor, Here. Baie dankie vir al die seëninge, die genade, Here. Here, gaan ook saam met ons in hierdie vergadering vanoggend, laat U ons die regte besluite sal laat neem, Here. Die leiding in hierdie moeilike tyd waar ons is, Here, waar die ekonomie baie swaar kry, Here. Here, laat U ons sal help. Gaan so met elkeen van ons in die verskillende kommuniteite waar ons is, in die besighede, Here. Sonder U kan ons nie die wysheid kry nie, Here. Ons vra dat U vir ons die wysheid sal gee om dit beter te maak. Om U naam te ontkom. Amen.
Dankie, Tinus.
Omri.
Yes,
Just before we start, can everybody please switch off their videos just so that the frequency is good throughout the meeting?
Yeah, so just switch off all your videos and your sound. And if you want to say something, just switch on your video, then we know that you have something to say. It helps with the joint connectivity if you switch off your videos. Okay. All right. Let's start with Dewald. Dewald, tell us what is happening in the red meat value chain, please.
What a wry smile, Omri. But let's not go there now.
Okay, let me just introduce Dewald. Dewald is the CEO of the Feedlot Association of South Africa. He's also a part of the
Omri, you froze. Dewald, would you like to just do an introduction for yourself?
Omri froze, yeah.
Okay, morning everyone. I am, like Omri just started to say, the CEO of the Feedlot Association. And as the South African Feedlot Association is a member of the Red Meat Industry Forum of the RMIF. Omri asked me, it's a 5-minute, just to give you a little bit of an update in the red meat industry, what's currently happening. I divided it into 2 portions. The first is local. Obviously, there's a lot of turmoil at this stage in our local markets because of what's happening. The demand is a bit array. Last week was much better with regards to the weaner calf prices. This week again, it's down. So there's not a lot of stability at this stage. We hope to see that the market gets stabilized once everything is open again, and it looks and it seems as if when the people now starting to get into their old rhythm again, that we'll be selling, or there will be a constant demand with regards to the red meat. Short term and long term is actually the same at this stage, and we're looking at 3 days. In the span of 3 days, anything can change in pricing and with regards to demand. It's very quiet. Like I said, last week there was an upward trend with regards to the prices all over, and suddenly this week or from the weekend there was a drop again. So very volatile. Obviously, there's the retailers is driving a lot of this, and it's understandable. If we look at exports, so locally maybe, like I said, we're not bullish yet. At this stage, we can see that there's an upward trend, and we hope that by the end of maybe this month and beginning next month, half next month, that the prices would look better. From an international perspective, it's actually very interesting to see that there's been some flickering of hope with regards to our exports. Some of the international markets are opening again and looking for the higher value cuts. The restaurants and the hotels are starting to look to engage with our export or our meat again. The Chinese beef market is very quiet still. They actually at this stage pressing to negotiate or renegotiate the prices. So they are very hesitant to take on new deals, and I think the whole Australia-China thing has quieted down a little bit. But that we see that as being a price-driven strategy from the Chinese. There's an upward, maybe just a quick thing, there's an upward trend in chilled beef in European markets. Now at this stage we can't deliver into the European markets, but Brasilia that do deliver into that market actually creates space for us in another market when they go out there to deliver in the European markets. Brazil actually did very well throughout this whole pandemic, but we see that the COVID-19 is actually now only starting to take the toll there, and they're starting to get positive tests or positive people in their abattoirs and in their packing facilities, which is slowing them down. Again, like I said, Argentina is actually doing well. Their exports is up 18%, although their prices is down. So they're exporting volumes, but their prices pretty much is down. Just in wrapping up this, I think we are very positive that come the next 2, 3, 4 weeks that it will stabilize, that the price will start to get back to normal, or that the demand actually will get back to normal. The prices have dipped, specifically with regards to weaner prices and slaughter prices to a certain extent. As I've told you throughout, there was lower or less slaughterings because of the lower demand. But it's stabilizing, and we're happy to say that I think we're going back to normal. There was a few questions in this week with regards to have we laid off any people and how is our employment going. I think it's going fairly well with our employment. I do not know of any per se and feedlots that is totally closed down at this stage. Most of the guys, the smaller feedlots that offer abattoirs that closed prior to COVID to reserve or preserve themselves. So I think a lot of the guys will start to open up again.
Okay, Dewald, I'm just going to ask you a couple of naughty questions.
Yeah, don't.
When are we getting a traceability system in South Africa so that we can manage FMD and export more meat? Okay,
so we are busy. There's a non-profit organization, an NPC, that is set up, and we are driving that at this stage from an industry perspective, from an industry side. The industry role players within this, or the shareholders in this NPC, is the RPO, SAFA, the auctioneers, the milk producers organizations, and Agri NARPO. There's also a LITS SA traceability or LITS system being run by government. That is going to take a long time. I don't think that will come off the ground easily or very quickly. But from industry side, we're saying very important. We need to drive it from our side. When is difficult? As soon as it's implemented from the start. So we can do it immediately, but there's a quick and a very hard drive at this stage to say that we need to have traceability. But there's more than that. It's not only traceability. It's also total visibility. It's operations visibility. And we've been speaking to a lot of banks. We actually had a meeting yesterday to look at funding for farmers specifically on the animals.
So that's the idea, to have a self-regulatory system.
Yeah, we've got to go for self-regulatory at this stage. There's a whole plan on the table with regards to separating two systems. The one is a government-driven system, and the next is an economically driven system. The one is based on fear. If we look at FMD and managing that from a government's perspective, that is based on fear. The economic system, as it says, is based on economic value added to the farmer, the feedlot, the abattoir, etc., throughout the value chain.
Do you think we can open up more markets if we have such a traceability system?
Yes, definitely. It will give us some backing, and it will definitely support us at international markets. Yes, definitely.
All right, Dewald, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you for the input. I really appreciate it. Guys, if you have any direct questions for Dewald, please give him a call. We'll share is that okay if we share your number with the other people as well?
No problem. Thank you, Omri.
I think Dewald has some other problems he has to sort out as well. So, okay. Next guy, Jannie, please tell us what's happening in the grain value chain, as well as maybe just inform the group of the national master plan process that we're part of.
Thank you, Omri, and good morning, everybody. Let me start off with the grain industry. As you've asked me, if I start internationally, I think there's plenty of stocks in the world. So I don't think there's a problem as far as that's concerned. Today, the International Grains Council is meeting. Some of our people will be attending from here to find out what is going on around the world. So we will probably have a much better idea internationally from people directly. And then as far as the broad food supply from grain side is concerned in South Africa, we've got a great crop at hand. We're still battling to get it off. So all in all, I think national food security is well intact for this season. If I start locally in the northern parts, we're busy harvesting. We're progressing actually very slow because of the late rain that we received in April. Mpumalanga has done about 20-25% of the maize is off. Eastern Free State about 15%, and the West hasn't really started in big numbers yet. It is quite wet, especially in the watertafelgronde. This is now in the northwestern Free State. As the farmer stated, sometimes it's easier to get into the lands, but they can't get out of it. We are worried about the short supply of diesel. We need a lot of diesel in these times to harvest and to get it to the silos. So this is a concern to us. But in general, I think it is going well. The prices are fair, I think, for the current circumstances. And we have heard, very small patches where there might be some quality problems because of the late rains that we've received. Then when we move down to the south, we've already said they've received good rains, and it's also today, there's a lot of forecast for today and even further into the week. The wheat and the barley and the canola has emerged well. Here and there we've got some small problems, but I think in general it is looking quite good. We were very worried about the barley because of the limitations on the sales of alcohol. I think, we were worried that the only buyer is not going to buy up the crop, but the farmers had to plant. I mean, that was a very awkward situation. Then just interesting, I shared yesterday with one of our country's great economists that we are seeing record consumption numbers in white maize and millipop. Huge increases since the lockdown, and I think we all understand that this is a very clear indication that the people are suffering when they move away from the red meat and even poultry, and they buy a lot more maize meal at the moment. So all our other commodities like the wheat and the soya beans going into the poultry and those dairies and those things, all of them are actually, the consumption is currently increasing. And I think most of it is because of the better crop that we've got this year. Last year we had a drought. So all in all, it looks all right. I think what we're worried about, Omri, is the next season. with the exchange rate, we've seen fertilizer prices, we import most of it, increased by 30%. We saw increases in chemicals that we use increased by 30%. So those are big concerns, you know, and the whole thing about the land bank not being able to finance farmers. I think, you know, a lot of the hectares that we plant every year to get enough maize, especially, is financed through the land bank, and that could bring about a problem. The last one is just a cry. I don't think we're going to see a NAMPO this year in the grain industry. For us, it is not just a great event, but it's also a nice get-together, and I think we will surely miss that. We will take a final decision on that in the end of this month, but you know, all the indications are that we probably not have it this year. Omri, then if I just move over to the plan quickly. End of 19, we sat down with government and labor. We designed a sort of a path and a time frame moving forward. We made it very clear that we are not here to be consulted. We are here to design a plan together as a partner. And obviously with COVID, a lot of problems occurred in terms of the communication. And since then, there were actually very little communication. We had a discussion with the DG the other day because there was some the government will start consulting with some of the provinces. And if they consult internally, it's fine. But when they started consulting with the value chains in the provinces, that was not the sort of the format in which we agreed to. And we are worried that the government is going to put a plan on the table and then we just, you know, make comments on it, and then it's their plan, and then it doesn't get implemented. And then again, you know, like most of the others that we've done in the past, it is not going to contribute towards the growth in the sector. We've put, through the PPGI, the Private Partnership Growth Initiative with government, we've put together the priorities as a value chain. All the role players made some submissions. We know what is it that we need to get hindrances out of the way so that the economy can start growing. And I think for us as private sector, the most important thing now is to get the economy growing, and then we can fix, you know, along as we go along the rest of the issues. So at the moment, the process has started, but it is very flimsy and the relationships are not very good. The last discussions that we had, labor were more on the side of private sector than on the government side. And I think we need to get the three partners together and not just, you know, sort of somebody draft a plan and then, you know, make some comments on it. So we will discuss that, I think, later on today, but we are well organized to get mandates. We are well organized to feed back to the industry, but I can't say that for the rest of the role players. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Jannie. Thank you for that. I think it was very insightful. There's another issue that just came up. Chris Walkingshaw is from Total. I know we've had some issues with the provision of diesel. Chris, don't you just want to quickly update us on where we stand with this situation? It's starting to become quite a bit of a problem. Chris?
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, a lot of the diesel arrived in Durban, and the Durban refineries are back fully operational. Transnet are really, for the first time, South Africa was for many years sort of secured that the Transnet pipelines between Durban and Gauteng were quite secured, and then that's not the same for all the pipelines in the rest of Africa. They get frequently attacked by people trying to siphon and extract product. However, in the last 5 or 6 months, this has become the norm now in South Africa as well, and the Durban-Johannesburg pipeline get disrupted and are having between 5 to 10 attacks per week. There were a meeting earlier this week between Transnet and government trying to get additional security for that, and that since last week the coastal refiners have put in 25 million liters of diesel in the line, but the line can't move. So I know for ourselves, we've added another 150 trucks running from the coast to the inland to bring diesel to Gauteng and to the inland and the northern and eastern regions. But of course, trucks are very inefficient in moving large quantities of fuel. So the last of the refineries that were in shutdown due to the lockdown were Natref. Natref is starting up this weekend, so about 4 or 5 days from now, you'll get a product to start flowing, in particular diesel. The Secunda refinery had a lot of technical issues after the restarting when they fixed their problem. But in Durban, the refineries are back to normal. So there were about 3 or 4 ships arriving in Durban this week with diesel, so plenty of product. Unfortunately, in the wrong location. So it needs to get to the inland, and the most efficient way is through the pipeline. There are ongoing daily discussions between government and in particular Transnet, who are really battling to recover and repair a pipeline before they can proceed. And that problem have to be resolved for this to go away. Thank you,
Chris. I think we're going to ask you the next round as well, just to update us. Chris is from Total. They're doing a lot of work in the agriculture space. And this is obviously something that is critical for us. Thank you. I'm going to go to Werner van Rooyen. Werner, if you can just give us a quick update on the fruit and export market value chain. Morne, you can so long just switch off your camera and your microphone. We'll get you a little bit later. Werner, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yes, update from our fruit value chain. I think the most evident thing about our value chain is the constraints in the port, specifically the Port of Cape Town. They've been operating at about 30 to 40% of the labour efficiency, sitting now with about 14 days of berthing delays as well. So the port is really constrained at the moment and in crisis. We haven't seen the port in this situation, and this has been ongoing for a couple of 3 weeks now. Last week as well, we couldn't bring in any reefer containers as well to the Port of Cape Town due to the availability of plug points not being available. So the port is really the one constraint we as a fruit export community is experiencing. To provide a little bit of an update regarding the occupancy at the moment is about 74%. When you look at the truck turnaround time at the port, it's about 55 minutes, and they service about just over 1,000 trucks in the last 24 hours. So it's moving very slow. They are working about 3 gangs.
Werner, what's the reason for that?
The reason is they're working a very low personnel and limited staff at the moment. So they have about 3 teams in the morning and about 4 in the afternoon. So the truck capacity as well is also linked with the availability of the plug points and the loading of the vessel. So as the port get constrained, they don't allow any trucks in. So they work and service the trucks slower than usual. So that's the reason for that. But we also experience wind delays in the port, and I think during this time we also have weekly meetings with Transnet as well. We had a meeting last week with Minister Gordon. So the situation is serious and everybody take note, but the main reason for the constraint is the high number of positive COVID-19 cases in the terminal among the personnel there. So that is something unavoidable, and we are very concerned that flows over to the other ports like PE and Durban, as we had last week a case in PE as well, 2 cases of COVID positive cases in PE in the terminal. So they had to disinfect the whole terminal. So that is the main constraint at the moment for us, is the ports. Our volume on the volume side, we're looking very good on the citrus side. We look forward to a record harvest as well. On the grapefruit side, we're up on volumes. Soft citrus significantly up on volumes for soft citrus. Also lemons significantly up. It's a huge harvest. The markets are struggling to handle the amount of lemons as well. For grapefruit, if we look at the markets, we see good demand from Korea and also the EU, UK, good demand from there as well. Japan is under constraint, and we're servicing that market with caution at the moment. For soft citrus, if you look at the market for soft citrus, UK and EU is quite strong because of Spain exiting the market earlier with not a lot of volumes there. If you look at USA, South America will start to come into play in the USA now in June, so the market will be under pressure from now on in the USA. But Far East shipments are continuing for soft citrus as well. So if we look at the pome fruit market, and on the pome side, we can say with confidence that about pome volume is up 5% from last year. We see also a tendency this year of more shipments to the Middle East of pome fruit. Significantly more than previous years. Also, we see the same, or mostly the same, shipment volume to the EU, UK for pome fruit. The retail markets over there is handling the volume quite well. If we look at Africa, for our apple exports, the market is a little bit down. That may be because of the price of oil. And also some logistics constraints that we noticed that show that tendency. So that is for apples. If we go to pears, our pear market is a little bit down, matching it to last year, 2019. The Middle East also up on pears. We have a strong demand for the Russian market as well. That's going good thus far. And interestingly enough, Reunion and Mauritius is also taking a little bit more volume, although it's from a lower base that the percentage increased over there. Also for apples, Africa is also downward, a downward trend for Africa according to pears. So overall, the markets are faring quite well. The markets are fairly stable for our fruit industry. I think the most important point is getting our fruit out of the country and addressing the logistic constraints at home sufficiently.
Thank you for that update, Werner. That was very interesting. Okay, guys, so we're going to move on to the next speaker. Chris Cameron is from Bain Consulting. They were appointed by Business South Africa to do a study on the agriculture sector. I'm not sure if that study has been shared with everybody. But Chris, don't you just want to give us a quick rundown on your findings and some of the main themes that you found in your research? I must be honest, I went through your research and I really thought you did a good job. But Chris Cameron, if you can just give us an update on what you found and what are the main themes,
right.
It would be interesting for us. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Omri. Is everyone able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for the intro. Yes, so let me quickly take you through what Business for South Africa is. It's a voluntary association of business leaders, largely formed out of BUSA, VLSA, the CEO Forum, and some other industry organizations. They have been engaging the presidency and some of the key ministries like the DTI on the COVID-19 crisis, and then what will it take to actually restart the economy coming out of that crisis. So it's taking a midterm to a longer term view. Feedback from the presidency has been that they'd like us to look at all of the key constraints in the economy and put forward proposals around financial support, infrastructure investments, policy and regulatory changes. So it's very much a kind of break glass moment. What are the big things that we need to start tackling? So that was the brief on this piece of work. And to start with that, it really was trying to put together a summarized document for that level of conversation. Some of the materials I've shared with Omri and your team, you're more than welcome to share those with the rest of the audience after this call. The process going forward is this is all being currently reviewed internally by BUSA and a few other industry associations, and will then be consolidated and shared with the presidency within the next 2 weeks, and then there'll be further industry engagements. Looking at the way we framed the question is 4 things that we wanted to come out of the agricultural sector. It's really contribution to GDP, boost in employment numbers, continued food security, and increased nutritional outcomes for the people of South Africa and regional markets. Looking at the as-is analysis, we found the sector itself is fairly resilient. There's lots of growth prospects in it, and there's significant growth potential. The impact of COVID-19, when we looked across jobs, changes in supply and demand and infrastructure, was that on the job losses side, it's very sort of fairly constrained. So far, we haven't seen the kind of job losses that we've seen in other sectors of the economy. On supply and demand, we have started to see quite a few shifts on baskets. So looking forward, what we do expect, and I think one of the previous speakers mentioned, is the composition of the baskets will move a lot towards carbohydrates from some of your more high-value proteins. And then on infrastructure, sort of no immediate impact. When we then had a look at what are the key challenges, there's really 5 that we want to sort of have the engagement with the state around, and that's access to finance for the agricultural sector. The issues around the land bank and other commercial sources of capital are significant at the moment, and resolving the issues around the land bank is fairly key. Proposals in that regard is to potentially split up the mandate of the land bank between a commercially focused role and then also a developmentally focused role. And then the state providing the funding for the developmental one, but then a blended financing model as well on the more commercial side. On the land reform side, significant issues around the 3 topics of land reform. There's redistribution, restitution, and then land tenure rights. On redistribution, there's significant opportunity to go and unlock the processes which have become very log-jammed over time, and make sure that process is concluded a lot faster. On restitution, again, similar issues around process, and then also revisiting some of the issues around expropriation without compensation, and making sure that whatever's put forward is kind of investor friendly. On land tenure rights, when we're looking at unlocking parts of the agricultural potential in South Africa, in particularly traditional areas, we need to go and have a look at how do we actually get land tenure issues back onto the table to make sure that if people want to go and open up those sectors or those hectares, we have a framework which enables businesses and individual farmers to go and negotiate to gain access for land and secure it. On water infrastructure, huge problems in that area and massive investments required in that space, and bulk water infrastructure, Western Cape and Limpopo being key areas. Having a look at all of the stalled infrastructure investments that have happened there over the last few years and starting to unblock those. And then on transport infrastructure, as mentioned earlier, on big issues around the ports of Cape Town, but then also ports of Durban. Half of that is actually largely related to efficiency issues, not necessarily a lot of the infrastructure we have. So it's how we run our ports will solve half of the problems that we've got. There are certain investments required in expanding the infrastructure and deepening ports and the like, but a lot of it is, our analysis shows, is that we're running our ports fairly inefficiently. And the 5th point is around access to new markets. there's an issue around coordination between the DTI, DIRCO, and DAF in defining a true coherent export or trade negotiation strategy for key markets, particularly in Southeast Asia. And the proposal around that is really to rethink the entire issue on how we set strategy around our trade negotiation, who leads trade negotiations, and how do we go and get to negotiating a lot faster than we have in the past. Looking at the all of these 5 key issues, and there are many more. We acknowledge that there are many more issues that need to be resolved. Ranging from skills development to sort of secondary infrastructure. But we believe that there's significant opportunity to go and address all 5 of these key issues. There's very tangible things that can be done. If we're looking at things like investments into enabling infrastructure, there's some, just getting things like PPPs moving again, and just getting a lot better around sourcing funding and bringing in the private sector. We believe all of these put together has the opportunity to raise job creation by about 60 to 80,000 jobs per year in the agricultural sector, increase GDP by at least 10 to 15 billion, and 3 to 4 billion in additional tax revenue, and then start to increase or reduce actually childhood malnutrition in the country by about 2% per year. Because at the moment, up to a quarter of children under the age of 5 in South Africa actually show signs of stunting based on nutritional issues. And so those are the key things that we're looking at. There's a longer document, very happy to share it with you, which sort of outlines some of the more concrete recommendations. We've also put together a timeline of what needs to be done over the next 6 to 24 months, and then what needs to be tackled over the next 2 to 5 years. This is, some of it is, there's some very clear, easy wins to go and sort out, particularly around land reform and the funding models for the land bank and the mandate of the land bank. But then there's also longer term ones like, sorting out infrastructure, water and ports and road is going to take a lot longer and requires an enormous amount of investments. That's pretty much it from our side. Very happy if anybody in the audience would like to sort of reach out once you've had a copy of the document to engage with you further on it. But that's pretty much it from my side. Any questions?
Okay, Chris, I'm going to just not allow for questions now. Let's and go over to the next speaker. So we're going to circulate this document to all of you. I think it's one of the better documents that I've seen on agriculture. So most of us are CEOs of companies and organizations and provinces. So I think go through the document in quite a bit of detail. If you can, it really points to some of the key issues in agriculture. It was done by the Bain group, so it is nice to actually get a bit of a objective perspective on the sector. And thanks for the work that you guys are doing. Chris and his team is consulting with us. They have been consulting with us all along. So we will be, Jannie and I are part of the technical task team, and we've also given some comments on the document, specifically Jannie and ourselves. So we will be continuing engaging with them on the process going forward. But I think it's one of the better documents that I've seen on agriculture. But we'll share it with all of you, and then if there's any questions, you can let us know. Okay, Morne, you are up next. You're our keynote speaker for today. I mentioned to everybody that you were in Wilgenhof with me, and that you progressively got weirder as time went by. At least I see you've got an alcohol stash there at the back. That works very well. Just so that you know, Morne taught himself to play the piano when we studied, so he wasn't the best of students. But I think things changed for the better. So Morne is the head of the Stellenbosch Institute of Futures Research. He's got a PhD, And he's quite a well-known speaker. Morne, you've got an audience of in excess of 60 CEOs from provinces, commodities, and corporate companies. And we are all wondering what's going to... Willem, can you perhaps just put your camera off, please? Willem Beesbier. There we go. So obviously, Morne, part of our contingency planning last year did not include COVID-19. Please share with us your views, how you see the world changing, how you see South Africa changing, and then we can open up the floor for some questions. Morne, over to you.
Thanks very much, Omri. I appreciate the invitation, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you. You can see I've set up shop here in the bar. The last time I worked in a bar, I think I was a student. Omri, maybe you could just give me a quick guide on the time frames here. That'll give me some sense of where to focus.
You have about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions.
Okay, thanks very much. So perhaps if I could share a slideshow.
Sure.
And I think what I'll do is just give me a thumbs up if you can see that.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Ah, there we go.
There we go. Okay. So I think what I'll do is just talk very briefly about the scenario work we've done, and then talk about some of the big broad brushstrokes that we're observing. I'm not an agriculturalist and a specialist, but what the work we do is essentially to try and paint a few pictures of what's possible, and then to think about which elements are more probable, and then to make links between some of these broad brushstrokes and the key decisions that senior people have to make. So it's perhaps just worth noting that the scenario set was published in this book, and I think one of the first books in the world that came out on managing organizations during the COVID-19 vortex. We started working on this before we went into lockdown, and it came out about 2 weeks into lockdown, and we're really chuffed with what was produced there. There was a lot of media attention on the work we did. I'm not going to dwell on that. I won't talk too much about our philosophy, except to say that we're not, those of you that I've spoken to before will know that we're not crystal ball gazers. We don't try and kind of guess the exchange rate or anything like that. We accept things are highly complex, and what we essentially try to do is to develop some narratives about the future that might just form a kind of stimulus to executive decision making. That's the only thing we lay claim to, rather than predicting what we think is going to happen. So in the development of scenarios, as I've said, they're mainly about sense making. We're not simply projecting on. We recognize how complex it is, and that's one of the main reasons that we don't make decisions. We know also that futures kind of emerge. You know, they don't. One of the big risks when thinking about the future is a thing that we call status quo bias. Status quo bias is essentially the idea that you make the assumption that whatever's happening today is largely the way the future is going to work. And so you have this phrase, for example, called the new normal, which explicitly indicates status quo bias. And so, for example, when we had the rise of the alt-right in Europe, that was status quo bias, and we thought that was the new normal. And before that, that was Brexit. Before that, that was Trump. And before that, that was the global financial crisis. And before that, the dot-com bust. And before that, the dot-com boom. And before that, the fall of apartheid. And before that, the Berlin Wall. And so every time these major events happen, what status quo bias does is it makes you assume that whatever's happening at the moment is going to be almost the only thing that will be important in the future. And so what we try to do is to say, well, what else is relevant here? How do you bring all of this together? It is strategic, and so we work a lot with probability rather than prediction. So the scenario set that we developed looked at really kind of two big players here. On the one hand, on the left side there, what will society do? And on the right hand there, what will the virus do? And so I think one contribution in the way we did this work is we gave both society and the virus a kind of agency. And then we said, if you collide these things, what happens? What are the futures that emerge? And of course, I'm going through this rather quickly, but on the social side, so when we think about what will the humans do, we looked both at structural elements and behavioral elements. So what that means is both what's the sort of architecture of the society, but also what kind of choices do people make. And so if you look at the architecture, then you see elements like these, classic examples that we all know, taxi driver putting 26 people in a 16-seater. Look at that one on the right for a structural element. You guys know this better than I do. Less than half of households in the country have running water in their homes. So when you look at what's the probability, for example, that a society like ours will adhere to health protocols? Well, there are structural elements. You have to stay in your house, but you haven't got water in your house. So the probability is about 0 that you're going to stay in your house. And so these are the kind of things that we use to think about what's likely to happen. If you look at the agency side, the behavioral side, choice-based side, South Africa also has a certain kind of culture, one of the protest capitals in the world, one of the drunk driving capitals of the world. And so we're not the most disciplined society on the planet. We're not South Korea, we're not China. We have a kind of a certain culture, and we're expecting that to play out, particularly when a crisis hits. But so our view is when you look at the structural elements of South Africa and the behavioral or cultural elements, then what you find is that the structure doesn't really allow us to comply to health protocols like a corona situation. And the behavioral elements don't bode well for compliance either. Whereas if you look at the profile for other countries, the structures are very different and the cultures might be very different. So then when we looked at the virus, we said, so what will the virus do? And we looked at a number of elements. I should indicate we did this before everyone knew what all these things meant. This was about, as I said, a week before we went into lockdown. And so we looked at, of course, elements like infectivity, but also not only how infective is it, but how severe is it, how morbid is it? And it turns out that this is something that most politicians actually didn't pay any attention to. They only looked at infectivity. But one of the interesting questions is, even if you do get it, what will happen? And then we look at, even if it is serious, how likely are you to die? So, for example, we were very keen to find stats on what's the likelihood of mortality in people aged 15 to 55 without comorbidity. And actually, the answer to that is almost 0. So then the question is, is the kind of hermetic lockdown that we have now really the best strategy? And then the last thing that the jury is still out on this one is, how likely is this virus to mutate? And so when you look at the future of the virus, what's really interesting is the kind of future that a virus wants is a really interesting thing to look at. So on infectivity, what a virus wants is to become more infective. But what's really interesting is on lethality, what a virus wants is to become less lethal. And the reason for that is it doesn't want to kill off its host because it's essentially committing suicide. So what you really want as a virus, if you're a virus, is you want to kind of go there, become more infective and become less lethal. Okay, so when you put all of that together and we build a set of scenarios, and I've only got about 12 minutes or so I'll just do this very quickly and then get to some practical elements. But then we looked in social terms and in viral terms, in social terms, mainly at social compliance. How likely are we to be compliant as a society? And based on those structural and behavioral elements, we said, and we referenced many groups here, we said we're kind of quite unlikely. It's unlikely we're going to be highly compliant. We'll be fairly compliant, especially when they send in the military, but we're not going to be, head boy level compliance. When we looked at the viral virulency, we said it's obviously more virulent than the common cold or the flu, but it's not quite Ebola, the black flu, the Spanish flu. It's kind of somewhere here. So you can see how the scenarios in terms of probability start to emerge. And then just very briefly, we enrich the diagram, we add additional elements like government enforcement. And we asked here, how probable is it that the government will be a crack squad on implementation? And when we referenced groups there, their view was, you know, the pattern is that government's really, really hot stuff when it comes to policy, often not as good as they could be when it comes to implementation. And so that's exactly what we saw. Fantastic policy when Ramaphosa spoke. 2 weeks later, we're debating, should you walk your dog? Can you smoke? Should you wear open-toe sandals? And then we add another dimension here on health system responsiveness. And the question we asked there is, how likely is it that the health system will be agile, professional, responsive? Of course, going in, it was already problematic. So when you look at it, you put all of this together, then we end up in a scenario kind of here with fairly low compliance, moderate virulency, low to moderate government enforcement if you factor the military into that, and low to moderate health system responsiveness if you factor the private sector into that. And then just to conclude on these scenarios, and then I'll get to some practical elements. Scenarios, we then always look for a few kind of archetypes. And the one of them that we looked at was who would be the wild card here? And here we looked at the role of labor unions, and we said that the longer we stay in lockdown and as we come out, the voice of unions are becoming more and more vociferous, louder, more impactful. And that's exactly what we're starting to see now. If you look at SAA, the government wage bill, and so on. Then we looked for who would be a moderator, who could calm things down here. And there we looked at the media, the traditional media in South Africa, really high quality, some hysteria here and there, but largely highly accurate reporting. And then we said, well, who could catalyze a kind of a positive result of this? And so we looked at the media as well as higher education. South Africa has some of the best research institutions in the world. And so finally, then we looked at this fascinating role that business played as a kind of integrator. If you look at the pattern, the history of relationship between government and business in South Africa is a disaster on all international metrics. For example, on the Global Talent Competitiveness Index, the relationship between business and government out of 119 countries is 101. On that same index, the relationship between business and labor out of 119 countries is 119th. And yet business comes to the party, Mostert Foundation, Sanlam, Rupert family, Oppenheimer, a whole host of other CEOs and fantastic South African companies say, how can we help? And so you see, for example, a Cape Town International Convention Centre is converted into a field hospital within a number of weeks. Really kind of astonishing. So our main conclusion here, I'm obviously rushing a little bit, but our main conclusion here is that if you look at the initial reaction of the general population and the financial markets, their view, both of those views were that the most probable case is going to be the worst case. And our conclusion was that that wouldn't be so, that in fact, the dystopian scenario is not the most probable scenario. It's very well moderated by a few other elements, but it's not going to be a pretty picture. It's not going to be an utter collapse either. So then, Omri, just in the last few minutes I have, I'm just going to run through a few kind of obvious trends. And the idea here is just to kind of sit back and think, does this mean anything for my business? And what could I do? What does it mean for my clients, my products and services, my innovation, my value chain, my talent, and so on? So just very quickly then on social paradigms, one of the questions we always ask as futurists, if there's a crisis, is what will be the irrational hypercorrection? You know, only accountants and economists think that humans are rational. The reality is that humans overreact. We had this astonishing example of where, you know, a toilet roll was more expensive than a barrel of oil. And so we're always interested in how are they going to go flip to the other side. And obviously health is one of those. And for the agricultural sector, this has significant implications in the short term in terms of positioning products in terms of their health. Something maybe we shouldn't say too loudly, but there's probably going to be an increased equality in the short, medium, and we'll see what happens in the long term. But this was not good for closing that gap. We expect reduced levels of social cohesion, despite the efforts of some of the factions to move closer to each other. This is a very exciting one, the rise of science over ideology. It was really fantastic, for example, to see McKee's there, medical dye, especially at the early stages, showing us some science as the ideology quieted down. An international outlook, I think, is a really important one, away from this kind of national exceptionalism that South Africa is some special little case with special little rules, because that's a really dangerous perspective. And those two are also what we call normative futures, things that we'd like to see. And I do think these are some of the kind of unintended positive consequences of the COVID-19 lockdown, if one is allowed to be positive at this stage. In terms of social anxiety, a general social anxiety disorder, even before lockdown, anxiety was the #1 issue for millennials and even for aging Gen Zs. Now, maybe you're from a generation where you say, you know, suck it up, walk it off, life is tough, get over it. But this has very serious implications for the kind of investments that millennials will make. The oldest millennials are now turning 40 next year. It has very serious implications for the kind of purchases they'll make, you know, how your family will spend your money, how the next generation will take over your property and run it. And so mental health for both your talent as a CEO and also the role that mental health will play in your family context, this is one to watch, and one that perhaps previous generations didn't take seriously. It will have a real dollar impact in the next decade or two. Of course, there's always the risk of with any pandemic, of infodemics, kind of the spread of fake news. And so learning how to be discerning in your digital diet, I think, is going to be an important skill to learn. I've spoken about health. We think governance is going to be interesting, especially when we're looking for more certainty, but we can't look each other in the eyes. Universal in all crises is this phenomenon of the substitution effect, and that has a real strategy impact for any executive. So that means all your clients are now looking for alternatives. They've had time to think. And so I think one of the big mistakes you can make is to assume that clients will just stay to you when the freeze is over, when the lockdown's over. Everyone is now shopping around for alternatives. It has massive implications for global value chains. The spirit of experimentation we saw, which was a positive thing. What anxiety does to the mind is it makes you hoard things, brings down the cages, locks things down. And so even some of the corporates that had vast stashes of cash, some of that, of course, being eroded by COVID, they're likely to hold on in the short term rather than spend their way out. I've spoken about uncertainty. Maybe just on the generation side, you've heard of the millennials. We think there might be a new crowd coming called the coronials, and they're going to have some interesting characteristics, among others. In terms of education, we're going to see what you might call asynchronous autodidactics. In other words, these kids don't have to learn when the teacher's teaching. I have a 12-year-old, and he's saying all of this is recorded. I can do this at 1 o'clock in the morning. And so his parents, bad parents as we are, allow him to do exactly that. And he teaches himself. He figures out the topic, he Googles it, he YouTubes it, and actually just got his exam results, and he did pretty well. So proud father abusing the opportunity with Agri SA to brag about his child. But this is really, we've never had this disruption to education in the 350,000-year history of our species. And so this, I think, sets education on a whole new trajectory. We saw, for example, that Kuro has just started South Africa's first purely online school, and I think that's a very innovative company, and they're gonna clean up. We know that digital intermediation is happening all over the place, and if something's not digital yet, it is now. Gig workers, we think, will rise, especially with the rise of unemployment, which is expected to hit extraordinary numbers. And then a number of others, including economics. But Omri, I think at this stage, I've spoken so much, I feel like I should perhaps pause and you can guide me.
Continue, I think so I think we should just continue.
Okay, a few minutes then. Thanks, Omri. Of course, we know that borrowing is, in economic terms, we can expect borrowing to increase, and that's going to increase debt. By the way, South African household savings was already at zero, literally zero to negative, before we went into lockdown. So we expect debt levels to really shoot through the roof, and that's not just at an individual level. We know that that's going to be at the sovereign level as well. We can expect globally the rise in the power of international financial institutions. They came under lots of pressure in the last few years, but they're going to have to help with bailouts. It's going to be almost unavoidable for many countries in terms of loans, disaster risk finance with the World Bank and so on. Public-private partnerships are going to be inescapable. The government will not be able to do it alone. And I think in a sense for business, this is good news. Yeah, I mean, of course, we can expect bad debt. Equity is going to be interesting. How that shifts is going to be kind of a few examples. It's really been fascinating in this time of how many people have offered their work for free on Zoom. But it's going to be perhaps largely marketing orientated. We can expect a lot of consolidation as some of the bigger guys with cash reserves buy out some of the smaller guys. And that's in fact a very likely outcome, that the smaller guys just simply run out of cash flow and the bigger guys take them over. So maybe a little bit theoretical, but some alternative funding and payment models. Of course, we've already seen crypto, but we might even see the return of bartering if value chains increase their trend of localization. There'll be some opportunism, especially in terms of acquisitions. We've already seen some price gouging. We know that value chains are going to be a lot more hybrid, right? Because of the substitution effect, because of the fact that people are looking around, we're going to see a much more kind of fragmented value chains as people try to mitigate the risk of complex international value chains. And then because of the rapid rise in digitization, you know, those of us who are interested in the study of whether growth is sustainable as a global social paradigm, that's probably just been given a good shot in the arm by digitization and the reason that there's almost zero marginal cost for growth. You know, I've spoken about the unions, and then just finally, of course, we've seen rapid digitization. Part of the reason that we're expecting a rise in inequality is because of the rise of the digital elite. Just think about it. You've had 24-hour high-speed access to the internet. You've managed relationships. You're up to date with information. You've managed your finances. You've even invested differently. You've maintained your professional network, even expanded it. Now compare, your children have been educated. Compare that now to people who don't have access to the internet. And you notice that people just languish, absolutely desperate neglect. So that digital divide is very likely to grow. Part of that will be seen in this phenomenon of tele-everything, including monitoring your farm. That's already happening, but that's just been accelerated by COVID. Disintermediation, the idea that technology is just taking us over, of course, we know that that's just going to expand. So anybody who's just got a middleman kind of role is under severe threat in the really short term. If there's no real value add, then disintermediation is just going to take you out. This is maybe an interesting one, the new science of face-to-face. We've realized perhaps that technology like this, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Skype, WhatsApp, is really useful for kind of sharing information, but not so good for establishing trust, authenticity, not very good for 21st century type work, creative problem solving, innovation. And so fascinatingly, I think in the presence of the rising technology, we're going to see a lot of new science around face-to-face and why that's so powerful and valuable. And then finally, and maybe this is a little bit of a concern, if maybe just a little flag there in the background, and that is the rise of the big man, the strong man government. If you are a closet dictator, this is your time to shine, because you can use the disaster status to publish almost anything, and you can say, well, it's a national disaster, that's the rule. And so there's a little bit of concern there with some of the people we've spoken to, that governments, not just the South African government, any government, can hide policy that they've always wanted to launch behind the smoke of a state of disaster. And so I think civil vigilance, holding government accountable and paying attention, and a vibrant media, a dynamic higher education sector is really important here, especially when it comes to things like surveillance, where The smoke can be, well, we're just monitoring your health. Well, now we also have to monitor your movement at the same time. And a number of others. Maybe I'll end on this, Omri, and just say that here are just 5 seeds of hope for us. And that is that we have seen some very powerful active citizenry. We have seen astonishing levels of media freedom, and I think we should be complimented on that. We've seen the maintenance of an independent judiciary, of academic freedom, such as the enormous support for Glenda Gray, for example, and then this internationalization paradigm. And so, in the midst of all the chaos, I do think there's hope. Omri, I've shared a huge amount of information, but thanks very much. Just your audio.
Thanks for that, Morne. You've also shared some very big words with us, and we still don't know what they really mean, but we will Google it, like your son does. All right, I'm going to just open up the floor for 3 questions. Anybody wants to ask Morne any question, please let me know. Okay, there's a question. Yes, Jannie? You can just put up your little hand on your thing, and then I can see. Okay, Jannie?
My hand is not on my thing, but my hand is up. Thank you, Chair. Morne, thank you very much for this, and thanks for your assistance to help us understand what's going on. My question is, in all of these scenarios and things there, we need to get the economy growing, and for that we need the government to understand the economy and not the politics. We know they understand the politics because we don't understand that. But how do we get the government's mind frame from political ideology stuff to the economy to understand that we are in ICU as a country in terms of economics? How do we get them to adhere to the economic, let's say, principles that business want to follow? That's my question. Thanks.
Thanks, Jannie.
Perhaps I can just have a quick response there. One of the things that we're starting to play with is whether it is in fact true that the government, and of course that the government means many things, whether it is in fact true that the government doesn't understand the economics. And we're beginning to think that that's just, that's not the case. They understand extremely well. It's just that that's not their goal. So, for example, if you look at some of the work that we've done around SAA, what we said there is that if you look at the plan, for example, it's just not a commercial plan; it's a political plan, and the reason for that is that SAA is symbolic. It's not meant to be a commercial entity. So I think that's the first important point. That my sense is that it's not that they, and that's a big they, don't understand it. Actually, they understand it very well. It's just that they're in a different game. So how do we do that? Well, I mean, we all have a view, right? But my view is that we need a lot more business activism. We need a lot more executive CEO activism, and we need a lot more collaboration between business and the academic world. Because if you look at, let's say, professional management in South Africa is rated in the top 30 in the world. Management schools in South Africa are in the top 30 in the world. We've got seeds of brilliance in the country, but we're being drowned by the politics. So I don't think business can maintain this kind of agnostic approach that we're just in the game of making money. We don't concern ourselves with profit. So I think in a country like ours, given where we are, CEO activism is going to have to grow.
Omri, Crystal, you are muted, Omri. You are muted. Omri, you are muted.
Someone is muting me all the time. I'm not sure. Okay, first Christy, then Tony. Christy?
Yeah, great presentation. What do you think? What should the route or what route should agriculture follow in South Africa in terms of getting their voices heard? Should we isolate ourselves, and should we have a very antagonistic relationship with government and shout and scream? Or should we suck up to government and try to be in favor of government all the time? Because I think agriculture is a bit in the desert in terms of how should they go forward in terms of relationships, etc.
Thanks, Christy. Morne.
Thanks, Christy. You've obviously given us a kind of a false dichotomy there. Should we suck up or should we fight? But one of the principles that we often look for is how can you get out of the boundaries of the system, and how can that give you a different perspective? So, in practical terms, and I know agriculture is already doing this, but I just want to encourage you guys to keep doing this, and that is work with the science, and that's not just agri-science, that's also economic sciences, and work with the international environment. I think agriculture has some fascinating international relationships. I know it's something that Omri is very skilled at, and I think this is a seed that can be developed in the impact that agriculture can have. If the moment we start building walls and we bring the gates down, I think then we're going to collapse. There are already such powerful international relationships in the agricultural sector, but I think those can be leveraged differently, not only from a kind of a business perspective, but also from a science perspective, as well as from an economic science perspective. So the moment you have an external view, the thing with, if you look at the history of Africa, the reason that dictators could behave the way they did after the establishment of the AU, for example, in the 1960s, is that it was isolated. It was dominated by its colonial masters. There was nothing called the internet, and dictators could say, I don't like the word Tuesday, we're going to name it after my mother. And actually no one would know whether this is a good or a bad thing. But what's happening all over Africa is the boundaries are starting to break down in terms of nation states, and internationalization, the leverage of the current international relationships, not only trade relationships, but the scientific relationships and the economic impact relationships, that I think is a very, very strong foundation.
Let's flip and mute thing. Okay, thank you, Christy. Thanks for that, Morne. Okay, Tony next, and then Jacques Jordan. Tony.
Thank you, Omri. Good morning, Morne. It's Tony Esmeralda here from Koteva. You spoke about every citizen reconsidering the way forward. I'm interested in terms of your assumptions about consumers' behavior, specifically in the food space for the middle class, the subsistence. What are you seeing in terms of that changing? All of a sudden, we don't have fast foods. Is that going to come back? Are people going to change their behaviors? I'm just interested on your thoughts about that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think if you look at consumer behavior in the food sector, then kind of one of the ways to think about it is what is the immediate irrational reaction? So what happens in the head of the consumer that's not necessarily logical? It's an overreaction to what's going on now. And what risks will that have in the short term, but also what window of opportunity does that give you? So health is the number one overreaction, right? So people are afraid of health, their own health and the health of their families, their aging parents and their children and so on. And so I think that the consumer is going to focus huge. I mean, it was already a trend going in, but now there's a lot of nervousness around health. Part of that is going to mean, unfortunately for some people in the agriculture sector, a temporary short-term shift to plant-based. And because that's assumed to have health benefits over some animal-based proteins, for example. And that's one indicator. The second one is localization. There is an irrational view in the mind of the consumer, we can debate how rational it is, that local is somehow healthier than foreign. And so I think those are the two key drivers in the mind of the consumer. How healthy is this thing, and how secure is it? And how local is this thing? Because then I can trust it. And then I think there's a short window that we have to convince the consumer using some of these things that are top of mind for them. I think if we're just going to wait for things to return, our value chains are going to be severely disrupted, because everyone is shopping around. Everyone is looking for an alternative now. And so the fact that you know that it's local and healthy, that's not enough. It has to be made explicit in the mind of the consumer.
Thanks for that. Okay, Jock, last question from you, and then I'm going to have a question, and then we're going to wrap it up. Jock? Jock, you're done. Ah. Jy is gemute, Jock.
Okay. Morne, post-COVID-19, what do you expect to the change in the international economic powers? There would be some, and also our priority markets for our products. What would be the future priority markets for South Africa? Would there be a change post-COVID-19?
Thanks, Jock.
Gosh, I mean, if we look at 195 countries, it's a tough call to make. But I think maybe one of the ways that you can do that analysis is to say, if you accept this this shift in this acceleration in health consciousness and in localization, then and you look at some of the other trends like the intra-Africa agreements, then I think, of course, the rest of Africa is going to become a lot more prominent as the economic regions in Africa start to mature. I think negotiating regionally rather than with individual buyers might become an interesting opportunity. If you look at price sensitivity, then you can expect that that in the South African environment and in many other developing economies, price sensitivity is likely to increase. And so for that reason, if you're let's say you're working on a premium product that has claims to health, there may be an opportunity there for a premium pricing strategy based on health benefits. Which countries are likely to win? I think the reality is that unfortunately, developed countries have responded in very general terms, except perhaps for the United States. But if you look at in general broad brushstroke terms, developed economies have responded better, and they have deeper pockets. They have deeper buffers. They're more easily rescuable. If you look at, for example, the kind of 350 Rand a month response from the South African government, that's already amazing, but we just don't have the deep pockets. So I think those are some of the metrics we're going to have to use to scan the world and think, okay, so who's got deeper pockets, who's more resilient, who's going to join the accelerated health revolution, and who's going to focus on things like organic and so on, and has the disposable impact to do that. Or you want to play in the mass game, high price sensitivity, and that unfortunately has now deepened in developing economies. That's a very broad response in the time we have, but yeah, thanks, Omri.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jock. Okay, last question from my side, Morne. Looking at, I'm going to ask you to look in the crystal ball now. The whole American Trump administration, what do you think is going to happen in America, and how do you see tensions between America and China playing out in the next year, 2-3 years?
The one thing that we always look at in the difference between those two countries is, especially from a future science perspective, is that China plays the long game. So China is like the Ramaphosa of world politics. They're always interested in like what happens 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line. Whereas in the American political cycle, and South Africa is a little bit of a victim of that too, but in America I think that's even worse. The short-termism is a real danger, I think, to that society. And so if you look at, we can debate where the baselines are for each country, but if you look at who's going to do better over the next 10 years, then, I mean, you know, I hate to make a prediction, but you've got to put your money on China, because they're always thinking the next 10 years is just part of the next 100 years. Whereas Trump is always thinking the next year is just an election year. And so it's unlikely that you're going to see healthy long-term decisions in the American economy. Whereas in the Chinese economy, you're very likely to see those long-term decisions. And so difficult to call in the next 12 months, but over the longer term, you have to back China here.
Morne, is Trump going to win the next American election?
What I will say is, unfortunately, it seems like he's got a chance.
Yes, it's 10 o'clock. Yolanda, stop muting me now, please. It's 10 o'clock. I want to thank all the speakers, Dewald, Jannie, Werner, Chris, other Chris, as well as Morne. Morne is from the University of Stellenbosch, and he's obviously a very interesting speaker, and I really hope from an executive perspective this added value. We will share the data we have. Morne, can we share your presentation as well?
You're welcome, Omri. Yeah, you're welcome.
So we will share the information we have with the group. And then I want to thank all of you for joining this. I think it was very interesting for me. And we will be having these kind of sessions quite often so that we keep all of you informed. Have a good day, everybody, and thanks a lot. We'll chat soon.
Thank you, Omri. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Dank je allemaal.
sorry, we had a connection break thingy.
Oh, here it is. Well, you know what happened? This one guy never left the meeting, so I went back into the meeting now. But if I hang up, he stays on the meeting. This is Kevin Du Plessis, Nitra Fosca. Can I say remove participant?
Yeah, remove him.
Okay, that's why the meeting never ended. Why would you?
It's because